in a big way right now. Now we're going to talk about global risks, top 5 threats to your business operation with Mr. Dale Buckner. Dale is the CEO of Global Guardian, former military, significant military, special operations. Dale has lived and operated in more than 70 countries. We're always fortunate to have him I said special ops. I'm sorry, Dale. I hope that wasn't an insult. Green Beret officer, special forces. But Dale brings us insight that nobody else can bring. And we've asked him to talk about lots of different aspects today, the situation in Ukraine and his thoughts on that, as well as what that's going to mean at home, as well as some domestic challenges we're seeing. And he's got a special insight in cyber. So we're going to try to get to all of that. Please welcome Dale Buckner.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it. I'm really here. I did want to focus in on top 5 threats to your business. I'm going to talk about a series of other topics that all kind of pile into that, if you will. Next slide. So I know you're all getting a heavy dose of the Ukraine. It's online, it's on the radio, it's on TV when you're watching it every night. I will give a bit of a tactical overview up front. I won't spend a lot of time on it. And then I'm going to talk about what does this mean for business and what's the translation globally for this. So as you look at this and you look at the map, I do believe that the Russian intent is now becoming clear. If you look in the top center, there's Kyiv, the capital. If you look on the far right, that is the Donbass area or the eastern border. And then in the south is Crimea, where if you weren't tracking, the Russians took that peninsula, if you will, back in 2014 without a weapon being fired. I do think that as you look at this, it is clear now, the Russians do not have enough troops. They do not have the capability to synchronize their air force, their ground force, and their naval force. They are stalled. And ultimately, they basically have 3 sections of the country, starting in the south with the expansion to Odessa, which is to the west of Crimea in the bottom. They will expand the Donbass in the east. And if they desire, even though the Ukrainians have fought well, and we've invested them significantly since 2014 with technology and training, and that has shown up on the battlefield, ultimately, the Russians, if they desire, have enough troops, enough equipment, enough rockets, missiles, artillery, that they will just wear down the capital of Kyiv, and eventually they'll take it, if that's their intent, which I think it is. I think as you look at this in the short term, where this stops, where we create a new normal, is Russia takes Kyiv, the capital, they install a Russian-friendly government, they expand in the east, they continue to expand in the south, and they connect the Crimea at the bottom or the south part of the map to the eastern side or the right part of the map, and they create a land bridge, and they now own all of the oil and gas ports to the Black Sea. And that's really, really important to them. And at that point, I think this is where it stops. We redraw the lines of what Ukraine is, because the Russians will never control the entire country. Just for perspective, I fought in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We, the United States, and we, NATO, never control more than about 50% of Afghanistan. We never controlled about 40% of Iraq, ever, even at our height during the surge from 2006 to 2008. So as you look at this, I think the central part and the western border with Poland, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia all remain open. And I think we redraw the map, and that's the most likely course of action where this stops. Russia claims victory. They now have a bigger buffer, and that's the short term. The long term is they either have an insurgency on their hand, which is expensive and long-term, and you lose a lot of men and equipment in insurgency, or they just continue to go after it and after it and after it and expand. And if this goes sideways for Russia, then the worst case scenario, absolute worst case, is it becomes a nuclear wasteland, because they park a tactical nuclear weapon in a portion of Kyiv, claim victory, and tell the West we won. So that's worst case. I think, most likely is much more palatable. It's much more manageable. Russia gets a part of what they want, but they don't take the whole country. So that being said, ultimately, this is going to affect all of us. It already is. You're going to see mass migration into Europe. It's going to disrupt workforces. It will disrupt the entire oil and gas supply chain globally, not only in the short term, but could affect everything long term because the West is basically turning its back. It will affect goods, products, services, and more importantly, if you're running a US LLC, for example, I do believe you're going to face a choice. And I know the audience I'm talking to, you're seeing this in the news, Papa John's, McDonald's, other restaurant chains who have vast footprints in these parts of the world, specifically Russia. They will face a challenge in whether they continue to operate in Russia. And I believe it's going to be crafted, right or wrong. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I think the framework is going to be, if you continue to do business with Russia, you're now facing a moral challenge. I don't know that it's truly a moral challenge, and I wouldn't characterize it that way. I think business is business. But in this case, I think you're going to face that question. And I don't think a lot of people are putting it in those terms yet, but it's coming, is my belief, if you haven't seen that yet. So I do think, my last point, and I'll move on, Europe is changed forever. It is changing right before our eyes, right in front of you. The global supply chain between major powers, Russia's the 11th largest economy in the world, is changing forever. You're even seeing China starting to push back from its earlier stance on Russia. And I think whether it's the restaurant business, the airline industry, the hotel business, travel, vacation, cruise ships, all of those industries are going to be affected materially. And we will not see the same Europe that we saw before, nor do I believe we'll see the same NATO, or the relationship between the US and NATO is going to change materially. And I do think it's going to strengthen. This has already brought that to bear. So I'll move on from here, barring any key questions in the short term, Stephen. But that's just a summary. And I think more importantly, this is going to go on for a very long time. More importantly, these are changes forever, not just short term, but forever, the effects of this.
Yeah, Dale, to your point about having a choice in the future, you may have seen this already, the Yale professor and his research assistants that keep a list of businesses that are continuing to operate in Russia. And so they're now being publicized. So I think that's going to emphasize that choice in the very near future. And as you pointed out, McDonald's was predominantly at the top of that list. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. And my last point on the response there is just seeing a company like BP, British Petroleum, leave $25 billion on the table was really interesting to me. I was stunned by it. I mean, that's an enormous decision that was made. And think about this, that decision was made in less than a week. I mean, corporate decisions at that scale just don't happen in less than a week, unless it's an extreme circumstance like this. And I think when you think about $25 billion immediately lost and a decision made in less than a week, it really accentuates how visceral this is. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this in my opening. I wanted to highlight top 5 business operating risk, if you will, over the next, what we believe is 12 to 18 months. Number 1, to give it some framework, regional conflicts. If you remember back in March of 2020, when COVID really started, you saw the fight in Yemen and Saudi Arabia go to ground. You saw all of the violence that was happening between the Venezuelan border and the Colombian border go to ground. You saw drug cartels in Mexico go to ground. Bottom line is everything from the war in Syria to the war in Yemen, to conflict in Africa, to cartel activity just disappeared almost overnight. It was pretty stunning to watch. And that being said, just in the last 8 months, if you haven't been watching, every single one of those conflicts has come roaring back. In fact, they're either at or exceeded the level of violence they were prior to COVID. So again, I think Iran, Afghanistan, Haiti, Colombia, all of these regional conflicts have just come roaring back. And as you think about putting people back on the road, or you think about opening back at scale, this should be part of your calculus is whatever the metric of whether it was high risk, extreme high risk, you have to assume it's going to be even higher in the short term. Next, number 2 is cybersecurity. We brought in just recently the head of cyber for the FBI to do a webinar. At the time, this is 5-6 months ago now, cyber at a federal level had increased with the Fortune 500 by 71%. It's exponentially higher today. And we here at Global Guardian have seen a 250% increase in cyber attacks with our client base. So this is real, it's visceral. And now with what's going on in Ukraine, I expect that number to even increase even more. Last point on cyber. This is a hard decision. These are really hard questions. If you have dispersed your workforce and you don't anticipate, for example, to ever bring back your accounting staff, to ever bring back your marketing staff, to ever bring back your sales force, let's call it on average 20 to 30% of your workforce might never come to the office again. If you're in that boat, if you will, the question is this: are you going to extend the same cyber security on those employees' cell phone, laptop, and desktop? And are you going to put rigor in their Wi-Fi system, in their router? Are you going to provide checkups? These are all hard questions, but the core question is this: are you going to extend that enterprise cyber you had in the office now to a dispersed workforce, and are you going to pay for it? And that's a really hard question. But I think if they're going to be dispersed forever, there really isn't a choice. I think you have to do this. Natural disasters, you saw both typhoon hit the Philippines recently, most recently here in the US, the fastest and longest tornadoes in the history of the country, back-to-back hurricanes in the Caribbean in 2017, so on and so forth. Whether you believe in it, don't believe in global warming, so on and so forth, not trying to convince you. What is a fact is these storms are more powerful than ever. And the question becomes, and I'll go back to that, work from home workforce, are you now going to provide duty of care to them in the same manner you would for a traveler if they're right here in the United States? And that includes the next bullet, health and medical services. And the number one play there is we've got a lot of adults that are working in corporate America that have been trying to balance COVID and kids and work from home. And there's just an enormous amount of stress. And I think there's a lot of mental health care that needs to be changed. And the question is, are you changing your policy? Are you changing your insurance to address that workforce that's work from home? And then lastly, violent crime. And you can see some of the headlines ripped right out of the papers and online here on the right. Ultimately, we have now going on 3 years in a row, we're seeing the highest murder rate in the history of the United States. And my question to all of you is, if you're operating globally, is this: if the richest country in the world with the greatest kind of safety net, if you will, to its poor, which is the United States, if that's happening here, what do you think is happening in Honduras? What do you think is happening in Yemen? What do you think is happening in Kenya? What do you think is happening in pick a country, Haiti? The financial crisis, i.e. financial carnage that's occurred, is going to have effects for at least the next 5 to 6 years, assuming that we do get our global economy back in order, which is unknown. But if that was to happen, these effects are going to go on for a long time. So again, as you're thinking about reopening, as you're thinking about traveling, your assumption of the threat level in Mexico needs to be elevated. Your assumption of traveling to Nigeria or even parts of Eastern Europe need to be elevated. This all goes into the calculus of reopening and retraveling and starting to travel again. Next slide, please.
Dale, just let me chime in just real quick so that everybody knows. Global Guardian is as its name implies, is a global operation, but they are available to create orientations for your traveling employees. They also can train about travel safety. And as Dale's pointing out, that's really challenging today, but they go further than that. They are a holistic enterprise-wide program. They also can handle evacuations and hopefully it never comes to this, but extractions in the event there's a kidnap and ransom situation, which, as Dale knows, is also on the rise in certain areas. So I just want to make you aware that Global Guardian provides these services. So if you're looking for a resource, they are the people to call. Thanks, Dale.
Yep. So I have 2 slides, and I do want to get to Q&A because I think it's the most interesting part. Lastly, just a macro snapshot. When you think about risk and you think about things that could threaten your business, whether it's reputational, physical, cyber, travel, so on and so forth, majority of these issues, and this is really myopic, what you see in corporate headquarters is the HR director runs insurance and risk mitigation. The chief security officer is focused on cameras and brick and mortar and maybe travel, maybe not. And then you've got a chief information security officer managing IT and cyber. And the problem is they're siloed. Typically, they're not integrated. But the simple reality is a majority of these threats don't happen in a siloed event. If one of your employees is kidnapped, the first question should go to the HR, the chief security officer, that says, do you have kidnap insurance? How are you going to negotiate your way out and how much money is covered? 2, your chief information security officer, can you wipe their phone? Can you wipe their laptop remotely? Can you track those systems? And can you stop any kind of breach that's already occurred? So on and so forth. My point is the whole team has a role here. Most of this does not get done in silos. It really does get done in a macro way. And that's where it seems that businesses don't do well, is when it takes the whole of the leadership to truly engage and it's not siloed in a singular event. That's when things seem to go poorly. So as you look at the things on the right-hand side, all of them are typically integrated is really the point. Next slide. And I'm watching my time because I really do want to get to some questions. So I'm going to summarize at a very high level here. My first question is, since COVID, have you gone back and done an after-action review of what's worked and what didn't? Were you surprised by your healthcare with COVID? What wasn't covered? Was travel or medical evac covered or not? If it wasn't, there's ways to fix that now. Did you have people stranded? Did you have businesses isolated? How did you get to people that were stranded? Did you have that covered? Did you know who to call? So on and so forth. Ultimately, are you challenging what systems you have? And that second, or the second bullet down there, the old playbook will not work in the new world order, is really this. If your insurance is siloed and you really don't understand the restrictions, you're inevitably going to fail. If your vendors who do services like medical evac, medical service, security evac, security services, security evacuation, event security, camera surveillance, all of those kinds of things, if they're not truly integrated and you don't have true global reach into the markets you're in, you have nothing. This concept that you're going to travel, track, and give people alerts, it only works when it's 83 degrees out, there's no wind, and everything's perfect. The minute it goes sideways, and you do have the shooting in Las Vegas, the Paris attacks, 9/11, the Myanmar coup, what we're going through in the Ukraine right now, none of that matters. It's all eyewash. So the question is, do you have real rigor if someone is kidnapped, injured, assaulted, or isolated in a combat zone or a terrorist attack? If you can't answer those questions right now viscerally and know them by heart, you're behind. And I think that's really the key takeaway here is ultimately what you're seeing over a period of time in the last, call it decade, is every year these events are becoming more visceral, they're more violent, they're more concentrated, and the old playbook's not going to work. So I'll pause there, Steve, and I've got 10 minutes according to my clock, and I'd love to take some questions. And no, on Ukraine, I've now evacuated a little over 5,000 people out of Ukraine, and we're in 24-hour ops, and that will continue for at least 1 to 2 more months, in our opinion.
Yeah, it's a tragic situation. I know you've got your finger on the pulse over there, so thanks for sharing that. Dale, I want to get back to your conversation around kind of domestic disruptions right now, just because you pointed out so well all the different things that are going on and occurring. and thank you for talking about the cross-functional needs, right, between HR, risk, and legal, because that's so important. But I want to get back to your point about, when we typically focus on travel risk, we focus on keeping people safe when they travel. But I know you and others that do what you do are now really transitioning into all the people in the workplace. Can you talk a little bit more about why you feel that's so important that we think about that from the get-go, not just those mobile employees?
Yeah. So in that respect, I'll answer this from the perspective of people, infrastructure, and cyber or digital. Number one, people. I think after COVID, there is an expectation that your work from home force, if you will now receive the exact same level of support as if they were traveling. That's first. And I think you've got to think about, if you do have those platforms already built in, just pivoting it, don't reinvent the wheel. You have some infrastructure more than likely. Just pivot it and now offer it out to that work from home. And what goes along with that is mental health, and what you're seeing, and I talked about the murder rate and violence rate and just what's happening in our cities. We've just never seen rates like this. It's violent right now in the United States in a way you've never seen. And that's tied to murder rate, that's political division, that's, protests. It's just, we're in a position in the history of the United States. I'm 53. I've never seen us more at odds over religion, politics, race, and sexuality. And I just don't think we're going to get away from those things. And I think it's creating a lot of friction. And the question is, how do we protect and provide aid, if you will, or services to our workforce? So that's people. Infrastructure, if you have infrastructure that you're not using because of COVID, you might never use, but you've got to maintain it until you get through renegotiations and figuring out your new footprint. You've got to figure out how to secure that, because you probably had either a combination of camera surveillance, access control, guards, when people are going out and in and out every day. Now, if that's not the case, and you're trying to figure out what's your future footprint, you've got to protect that infrastructure in the short term while you make those decisions. And I think that's got to be addressed. And then on the cyber side, again, I would just reemphasize, right here in the United States, we're now seeing more hacking, more ransom, more cyber cases in the US than ever. And it's because everybody's been working from home, and the security on this thing and the security on your laptop, your employee's laptop, and what happens off their home system and how they connect back to you is where we've really got to pick it up. And we've got to reinvent policy. We've got to invest in systems if you're going to protect that workforce, their workforce cyber hygiene. So I think all those things right here in the United States are now top of mind, well beyond travel and what happens outside the United States.
Dale, very helpful. Can you walk us through a scenario, a cyber breach scenario that you guys have actually participated in, just so that the audience understands A to Z how one happens?
Yeah, so we executed the third largest cyber ransom case with an oil and gas company based out of Houston about 2.5 years ago. The company was operating in 41 countries around the world. The hackers had come in, we kind of imaged all the machinery and figured out where this started. It was Russian. It came in 6 months prior to the hack, where they basically flipped the switch like a light switch and turned the company off. So this is how this kind of plays out. They shut the firm down. They do reach out through the dark web, say, this is me. We have all your data and it's all locked down now. Here's your ransom. We get brought in, we go into the dark web, make contact and say, this is me. We're here to negotiate. We had a insurance policy limit, and here's the calculus. They're losing $29 to $31 million a day. Their limit was less than $10 million. Our job in we were given about 6 hours, was to get as close to the insurance platform. But if we were within $2 to $3 million, you pull the trigger because you don't want to lose another $29 to $31 million. So we got them within a couple $1 million. And we then took millions of dollars, put it into Bitcoin, reached out, paid them through Bitcoin, indexed all the data back, and then we stood up out of their 41 country footprint, their top 10 their biggest profit centers, We reopened them in a very secure manner as CrowdStrike came in and then started reworking and rebuilding the entire cyber platform. And I think what was most interesting is, lastly, the hackers, they're incentivized to get your data back perfectly, because they know if you don't get your data back, you won't pay. And if you won't pay, then the whole system collapses. And make no mistake, this is a global business, and I use that word very precisely. Cyber hacking, cyber ransom, all of that is nothing more than a business. And if you do play ball with them, you're going to get your information back and get up and back and running. The caveat being, the FBI has now put out formally, we shouldn't pay hackers anymore as a stance. And that briefs well. The reality is, if you have a fiduciary responsibility and you're going to lose another $30 million tomorrow, does that really apply if you can pay $2 million and get back up and running? So I think that's the challenge here financially. And I think this is not going away. No one's figured out cyber. No one truly understands it. Not one of the big companies in the space has cracked it. And we, Global Guardian, are focused on the end user. I think the cell phone, the laptop, your individual employee, that's where the weakness is, not the enterprise security, if you will.
Dale, on that topic, will you talk a little bit about the challenges you've been seeing with VPNs, virtual private networks?
Yeah.
Because a lot of us feel like, okay, if we use a VPN, or we use it, right? We use it in our home, we use it whichever, that we're perfectly safe. Can you chime in about that just for a second?
So here's the problem. Not all VPNs are equal. And I'm watching my time. I've got 3 minutes.
You're fine.
Ultimately, there are a lot of VPN products on the market. The first question you have to ask yourself, is my VPN monitored in real time by a series of analysts, butts and seats, 24 hours a day? So that and I have a VPN on every employee, every cell phone, every laptop, every desktop in my company. I'm struggling through this just like every business, because there's no one button solution. Ultimately, I want my phones monitored, my company phones, so that if I'm online and I hit a hot link, and it's what they call a honeypot to Russia or China or North Korea or whatever, my phone sets off an alarm. The analyst that's monitoring my phone isolates my phone, shuts it down, and then wipes it so the hack can't go any deeper. So the first question is your VPN actually being monitored in real time? And the answer is 98% of them, 99% of them are not, because that's more expensive. So all VPNs are not equal. And there are lots of VPNs, if you do a little due diligence on them, that aren't actually as secure as you think. So VPNs have been cracked, depending on the technology. So you really have to have a robust service where it's end-to-end, it's actually monitored to ensure you truly are an encrypted environment when you're using your VPN.
Yeah, I think that's crucial. And we've been hearing stories about the VPN organizations, depending on who owns them, using them as data capturing devices. Yeah. Right.
Yes,
so
sir.
We got to be careful about that. Dale, let me chime in one thing for everybody. And then I want one last question for you, but we all learned from COVID about the importance of looking at our business interruption insurance much more carefully. And as Dale pointed out, with all of the different climate issues and the attacks, the domestic violence we're seeing, you want to work with your risk folks very closely to be sure that you have some coverages there should something happen. And as Dale pointed out on the cyber, depending on how robust your affinity programs are, the information you're collecting, $10 million may not be near enough. Is that fair, Dale? Is that, I mean, because
it is. Look, we're all going to pay 30% more in cyber premium this year. Yeah. Ultimately, I'll end with this. If you are a leader at your business, you have much more leverage to sit with your insurance broker than you think. I am so demanding on my insurance broker because I'm basically, and all of us face this, I'm buying insurance for the worst case. But if the insurance policy is written that every single restriction known to man, whether it's natural disaster, war, terrorism, whatever it might be, is written out, it makes no sense. So you have leverage to go back and say, look, I've paid you enormous amount of money over the last decade. I've never had a major claim. I want to negotiate this. And I think people have to do that now, but it's not intuitive. And if people just take it at face value and go, oh, that's how it works, you're not going to be in a very good position. So be aggressive on your insurance platform.
I think those are good final words. Thank you, sir. As always, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dale Buckner.